Today we're going to continue our journey into the Psalms, and I think that when you read a lot of these Psalms, they sound like they could have been written yesterday. The images are timeless, and the content is contemporary, like the Psalm that we'll look at this morning. We've looked at Psalms of individual lament in the past, and today we will look into a Psalm of national lament. Do you think that the United States is lamenting our cultural and religious landscape? Now, we know the ways of the world, and we know the situation that it's in. You just have to turn on the news and get a little glimpse of what it's like out there. But according to the Pew Research firm, there are still about 70% of Americans who at least identify as Christians. The numbers are falling. That shouldn't be a surprise to us. And I don't have to tell you that it is quite one thing to say you identify as a Christian and to actually have true saving faith in Jesus. It's very popular nowadays to say that we identify with or as things that we aren't. That way everyone can stand up and applaud our courage for basically living a lie, is what it amounts to. But as far as saying you are a Christian and actually being one is concerned, all you have to do, as I said, is turn on the news and see stories about churches just a month ago blessing abortion clinics and giving them their seal of approval. Those things have been happening for some time now. And these are the leaders of the church doing these things. So what does that do to your expectations about your run-of-the-mill pew warmer in these same churches? Doesn't exactly give you a warm, fuzzy feeling that they are completely sold out to Jesus and to the Bible. That's just one example, and there's many more that simply illustrate the fact that it is one thing to say you are a Christian and another to actually have and model faith in Jesus. As a nation, we know that we have fallen quite a distance from God in a very short period of time. And to top it off, in this century alone, these words were spoken from our nation's highest office. America is not a Christian nation. If we aren't lamenting this, then we should be. And more so, we should be repenting as a nation as well. I think that if we say that we aren't deserving of punishment, both individually and nationally, then we really are fooling ourselves. When God punishes people, though, He doesn't do so just because He's mean and He wants to flex His muscle. It is to rehabilitate people. Take a quick look back. This is 3,000 years ago to 1000 BC. And not sure in my slides where... Oh, it got out of order here. But anyway, 1000 BC, King David ruled over Israel. And there's a lot recorded in the Bible about him, both good and bad. And as a result of David's sin, God declared there would be strife among his family in the generations to come. Within a couple generations, under the rule of one of his successors, the fighting in his family affected the whole nation, and the country of Israel split. You had now Israel and a country called Judah. Each nation had their own king, and history showed us that Israel had a lot more evil kings than Judah did. In 722 BC, the next date on the slide, Israel fell to the Assyrians. For the nation of Judah, at least, they had a few good kings sprinkled in amongst the bad ones. That allowed them to survive a bit longer. And the prophet Isaiah had foretold more than 100 years in advance that they would be defeated and taken into exile And that prophecy was fulfilled in 586 BC, the next marker up there. And when they were overtaken by King Nebuchadnezzar, by the Babylonian Empire. So I want to repeat that all of that was set into motion by David's initial sin. That shows us the devastating and far-reaching effects that sin has. It can affect both individuals and entire nations. It is in the context of the nation of Judah being taken captive by the Babylonians in 586 BC that Psalm 74 was written. When the Babylonians invaded Judah, they did what people do in war. They left a path of destruction behind them. Specifically, they wanted to target the temple, which is where they worshiped God, in an effort to totally demoralize these people as well as defeat them. So I hope with this background that Psalm 74 will make a little more sense to you when we read it. We'll just read the first 12 verses or so of the psalm to give you a sense of what the psalm is about. And the words are on the screen. This is the translation, the LEB. I used this last week, and I think it has a good rendering of the psalm this week too. Why, God, have you rejected us forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? Remember your congregation that you bought long ago when you redeemed the tribe of your inheritance. Remember Mount Zion where you have dwelt. Lift your steps to the perpetual ruins, to all that the enemy has ruined in your sanctuary. Your enemies have roared in the midst of your meeting place. They have set up their signs for signs. They are known to be like those who wield axes in a thicket of trees. And now its carved works all together they have smashed with axe and hammer. They have set fire to your sanctuary. They have defiled to the ground the dwelling place for your name. They have said in their heart, we will completely oppress them. They burned all the meeting places of God in the land. We do not see our signs, and there is no longer a prophet. No one with us knows how long. How long, O God, will the adversary taunt? Will the enemy treat your name with contempt forever? Why do you draw back your hand, even your right hand? Take it from your bosom, destroy them. But God has been my king from long ago, working salvation in the midst of the earth. The Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of His holy word. We can tell from the words of the psalm that times were desperate for God's people. They've been relocated out of their homeland. They have seen their holy temple destroyed, and they have no idea how or when they are going to get back to the land that God promised them. We see through this saga that God is willing to punish His people in ways that give them incentive to return back to Him, stronger than they were before, allowing Israel to be taken captive by the Assyrians, and then allowing the people of Judah to be taken captive by the Babylonians as punishment for their willingness to follow pagan practices generation after generation after generation, despite being warned by the prophets that these things would happen. This illustrates to us that God's ways don't always make sense to us, because we look at this and we sort of think, okay, God's people did wrong, we admit that, but isn't the punishment a little too harsh for the crime? I mean, all they did was worship some pagan deities. Isn't that what people say nowadays? My religion is personal, so I'm not hurting anyone, am I? Not to God, it's not. It's not personal to Him. To Him, our worship or lack of worship is the most important thing there can be. And as far as the punishment not fitting the crime is concerned, God knew exactly what he was doing when he allowed them to be taken captive. From a human perspective, it seemed like the solution to the problem was a lot worse than the problem itself. It reminds me of a scandal that took place about 30 years ago. It was in 1987. It occurred in college football, and it regarded Southern Methodist University. As you may know, college athletes are not paid for their playing services, we'll put it that way. But that doesn't stop some people from either trying to pay them under the table or twisting or breaking the rules. And that's what happened at Southern Methodist. Simply put, they were a very small school, and they wanted to compete with the big boys in college football. Being completely honest, that's where the money is. So, in order to attract more talented players, they had to sweeten the pot, as they say, and they did so in the form of cash payments on the side, fringe benefits, those kind of things that were against the rules. After being put on probation by the NCAA over the prior decade, multiple times, in 1987, the NCAA did an investigation that resulted in them handing down to SMU what they called the death penalty for their football program. That means the NCAA has the authority to completely shut down any school's program in order to send the message to them that they need to reform. In the case of SMU, they were suspended and penalized a whole seasons of games, loss of scholarships. They were fined a lot of money by the NCAA and even more things. This is the only time in the history of college football that this so-called death penalty was handed down. Back to Psalm 74 now. The Babylonian captivity, when they were taken, the people from Judah were taken against their will to Babylon, that was more or less like the death penalty being handed down from God, because now they were completely at the mercy of their enemies, or at least so they thought. And honestly, I don't really care for that term, death penalty, whatever they're talking about the NCAA, because it sounds like it's the end of the road and you're completely shut down for good, and that's not the case. They do this with a plan to rehabilitate in the future and to rise up and start afresh. It's exactly what God is trying to do by allowing first Israel and then 150 or so years later the nation of Judah to be conquered. The important concept to remember is that when God punishes people, He does so in an effort to rehabilitate them, as I said earlier, similar to that college football death penalty. When God punishes His people, it is not punitive in nature, because He is gracious enough to not completely destroy them like He did to, say, Sodom and Gomorrah. Moving on to the second point now, this is much shorter, but I think it's probably the most important point of this message, is that it is human nature that we often, it's easier for us to see how others offend God rather than how we offend God. In Psalm 74, we get some details about the destruction of the temple. You have these pagans breaking in, wielding axes and hammers, and setting fire to the house of God. Just imagine if a group of vigilantes came in to this church and wanted to destroy it. We would be helpless. We would just be standing by, watching them chop into the picture of Jesus on the wall, taking a sledgehammer to the pulpit podium up here, setting fire to the padded pews. Seeing something like that should move any believer to tears. We know that our worship is centered on God, or at least should be. But even though we don't worship the church building, we have this emotional attachment to our place of worship that becomes a part of our life. And for us, this is a good place, and we come here once a week or so, and I hope that we made a lot of fond memories here. So it would be terrible to have to witness its destruction before your very eyes. And to add insult to injury, the destruction of the temple was actually an attack on God himself. See, the church, 21st century New Testament church, is the same as the temple in the Old Testament. It's an earthly representation of God, and that's why people want to destroy it. They can't attack God personally, so they go to the next best thing. Now, here is the twist to it, and this is the one thing, if you take from anything from this message, I hope this is it here. This is that the people who witness the destruction of their own temple can see how horrendous these things were that were done by the other people, but they never recognize their own sin over the last 100+ years for what it was. What I mean is that for over 100 years prior to that, they were destroying the temple themselves. The only difference was you couldn't see it on the outside. They were slowly destroying it in a spiritual manner. They were involved in all sorts of pagan practices. Many of these were condoned by the kings that had risen to power. It's sort of like if we bring some Ouija boards into the sanctuary and we set up an idol over here that we're all going to bow down to every Sunday before we leave. We literally wouldn't be destroying the actual church building, but we would still be destroying the purity and sanctity of it. They couldn't see their own destruction of the temple, but they sure could see the literal destruction by their enemies. That's how it often is. It's very easy for us to see the faults of others as clear as day, but we're often blind to our own sinfulness. It's sort of like, this is a real contemporary in the new subject now. A lot of Christians condemn homosexuals for the way that they live their lives. And I never excuse the sin of homosexuality whatsoever. But what about the lust of heterosexuals as well? We sort of want to, brush that to the side. That's not as bad as what these other people are doing. We think in our minds God's going to frown on this sin a lot more than this sin. And it's never our sin that he frowns on. Or maybe it's sort of like us being enraged at someone breaking in here and spraying graffiti all over the walls when we came here with the intent to stay afterwards and have a game of poker and, down a case of beer and get drunk. Okay? Is there really a difference between the two? It's more like a difference without a distinction. Moving on to our third point this morning and last point is that the writer never questions God's judgment. He asks several questions of God, but they all deal with his future plans. They don't question him for what he has done. We need to realize that God's judgment is perfect, and we need not question him. Again, just think of the United States of America. You can call it God's judgment, or you can call it God allowing us to simply have the nation that we have created. But our nation is far from God in many ways. I think we realized this on September 11th, 2001, when 3,000 New Yorkers lost their lives. There were a lot more people at church on Sunday, September 16th, 2001, than there were September 9th, 2001. But how long did that really last? As always seems to happen, we get complacent and things start getting a little better and we decide, we don't really need God on a weekly basis anymore. So we're back to the way that we were before. And in that process, we create a nation without God. Look at us now. All these things are so out of whack from what they used to be, not that terribly long ago. We've redefined what marriage is. We have reduced it to the product of feelings for another person. That's all that it is anymore. Nowhere in the consideration of a potential relationship are we concerned about what God thinks about this. Now, since we've already redefined what marriage is, how do you stop that? How do you stop that snowball rolling down the hill? We find ourselves in a situation where the next logical step is to allow 3 or more people to get in a marriage together. Why not? We find ourselves in a situation where if I claim I love my cat, why can't I marry my cat? Okay, why not? If I love my cat, then that's what we have reduced marriage to. And, the question is, where do you draw the line now, since you have burst the door wide open? And the thing is, there are people out there who are pushing these ideas forth already. Okay, I didn't come up with these ideas. I found these ideas in the news. It wouldn't be all that big of a deal if the parameters for who we marry were mere human constructs, but they're not. They were handed down to us from God. And now we've said God's rule has no authority over us. And we have replaced God's law with a simple requirement of feeling love for another person or thing. It's not the only problem. Over the last 45 years, it's been legal to have an abortion within a few parameters. We don't want to be complete barbarians, so we put some restrictions on it. But we don't see those million-plus babies every year that aren't born. So sort of out of sight, out of mind. It took 45 years, but now we've gotten to the point where within the last month or so, there's people in positions of authority who are supporting killing babies after they're born now. That's the logical next step to allowing it to happen. And we shouldn't be surprised. I mean, again, once you burst open the door, where do you draw the line? I'm sure you get the point about all this. We are so much like God's people in the Old Testament, probably a lot more than we'd like to think. Just like the people of Israel and Judah, do we make compromises of faith, a little here and a little over there, out of convenience? We don't want to be seen as some traditional fuddy-duddy who's not up with the times. So, we want people to come into the church too, so I'm not going to talk about those kind of issues that rub them the wrong way. So, just think of this. When we compromise on God, how much of Him do you think is left to save us when we really need Him to? That brings up a good question, that considering the variety of sin that America tolerates, does anyone really expect Him to protect us from any future attack that may happen, like September 11th? I sure hope that God would protect us, because I know God is gracious, but we should never expect grace from God. If so, that would be injustice from God, which He certainly is not, because God is holy, righteous, and perfect. This psalm this morning is a cry out to God for Him to be holy, righteous, and perfect. And the writer of the psalm knows that in spite of all the wrongs that humans do, if you are one of God's elect, one of His children, then you are guaranteed victory in the end, because your relationship with God is such that you are, by extension, already victorious. It doesn't ever give us any kind of a pass to act in an ungodly manner. I'm sure that the people of Israel and the people of Judah thought that God was going to miraculously save them from the attacks that led to their captivity. Just think, they were probably more confident that God would save them because He made a covenant with Abram years and years before. They were the chosen people. They thought they had this in with God. But as they were watching God's temple be destroyed by these pagans, it was simply a picture of what they had been doing all along. So if God chooses to judge anyone, then it is His holy and righteous decision to do so, because He has that authority. It doesn't have to get to that point, though. The best thing to do is for a nation to revive itself through Jesus Christ, so that way God wouldn't have any sort of standing to judge us. But no matter what, whether we travel farther down the road of national sin, or if we do experience revival greater than anything that we've ever seen before, we know that we are each individually responsible for our actions and are responsible to God's call in our lives. Oftentimes, Christians think that God is punishing them like He did to His people so long ago, but oftentimes things with God are not what they seem. Maybe it's not that God is punishing you, but maybe He's simply setting you up and preparing you for something to accomplish for Him in an even better way than you could otherwise. So I want to leave you this morning thinking about the character of God, because the way that He interacts and relates to each of us is simply a reflection of His character. The writer of the psalm is concerned that God's punishment is going to last forever, but as he brings the discussion around to the fact that God's own character is at stake, it is clear that God isn't going to punish His people forever. We need to remember one of the most important aspects of God's character is His grace. Grace is never warranted, which is why when He dispenses it, we should appreciate it all the more, whether we receive it nationally or individually. Grace comes after we have been rehabilitated from our sin, as He removes the sin from us as far as the east is from the west. Let's bow our heads and go to Him now in prayer.